Nobody ever bankrupted an empire with a single bad decision. And nobody ever built one with a single good one either. You have been sold a lie wrapped in cinematic lighting, the moment of transformation. The single workout that forges the body. The one book that rewires the mind. The one pitch meeting that launches the fortune. Hollywood loves this lie because it's compressible into 90 minutes. Your brain loves this lie because it's less frightening than the truth. The truth is slower, quieter, and far more demanding than any single dramatic leap could ever be. The truth is this: empires are not built. They are accumulated, 1% at a time, in rooms nobody is filming, on days nobody claps. The problem beneath the problem. Sit with this for a moment. You already know, on some level, that consistency beats intensity. You've heard it in 100 different wrappings, small steps, baby steps, just show up. And yet knowing this has changed almost nothing about how you actually live. Why? Because the human mind was not built for compounding. It was built for immediate threat detection and immediate reward. Your ancestors who paused to think in decades about crop rotation while a predator approached did not pass on their genes. The organism you carry inside your skull is a magnificent instrument for surviving today. It is a catastrophic instrument for building decades. This is the first fracture point, and almost nobody names it directly. Your instincts are not your allies in this project. They are, at best, neutral. At worst, they're actively working against the very future you say you want. Consider a woman I'll call Adiz. Not her real name, but a composite drawn from a pattern I have watched play out across dozens of ambitious people. Adiz wanted to build a consulting firm. She had the credentials, the network, the intelligence. What she didn't have was patience for the invisible middle. She would work with blistering intensity for 11 days, driven by a surge of motivation after a conference or a conversation with someone successful. Then, on day 12, something small would go wrong. A client would go quiet. A proposal would get rejected. And the intensity would collapse into nothing. Weeks would pass. Then another surge. Then another collapse. 5 years later, Adiz had impressive bursts to show for her effort and almost nothing else. Meanwhile, a former classmate of hers, less talented by every objective measure, had built a firm generating steady six-figure annual revenue. His secret wasn't secret at all. He sent one prospecting email every single day. Rain, shine, heartbreak, triumph. One email for 5 years. That's over 1,800 emails. Adiz, in her bursts, had probably sent 1,800 emails too, compressed into perhaps 4 frantic months, followed by silence. Same total effort, wildly different outcomes. The variable wasn't talent. It wasn't even total hours invested. It was distribution across time. And distribution across time is precisely what compounding requires and precisely what human psychology resists. Here is the second fracture point. We are addicted to the feeling of dramatic effort because it feels like proof. Sweat feels like virtue. Exhaustion feels like evidence. A 12-hour work binge generates a potent cocktail of self-righteousness. Look how hard I'm trying, that a quiet, boring, 20-minute daily habit simply cannot replicate. So we chase the feeling of effort rather than the function of effort. We optimize for the sensation of building rather than the structural reality of what actually gets built. This is why New Year's resolutions die by February. Not because people are weak, that explanation is lazy and wrong, but because resolutions are almost always designed as leaps. I will transform my body. I will build my business. I will master this skill. The scale of the ambition triggers an equally dramatic initial effort, which is metabolically and psychologically unsustainable. The crash is not a failure of character. It is a predictable consequence of the architecture chosen. The paradigm shift. Here is where we detonate the myth completely. The size of your action has almost nothing to do with the size of your outcome. What determines outcome is frequency multiplied by duration, not intensity multiplied by drama. This is not a motivational platitude. It is closer to a law of physics applied to human behavior. Consider compound interest, not as metaphor, but as literal mathematics. 1% daily improvement, compounded over a year, does not produce 365% improvement. It produces roughly 3,700% improvement because each day's gain builds on the accumulated base of every day before it. Conversely, a single 50% decline can erase months of steady 1% gains in an instant. This is why the volatile, dramatic, boom-and-bust approach to building anything, a body, a business, a body of work, is mathematically inferior to the boring, steady approach, even when the boring approach looks less impressive on any single day. Empire builders across every domain understand this, whether or not they can articulate it in these terms. The founder who eventually sells for 9 figures rarely tells you about a single legendary all-nighter. They tell you, if you ask carefully enough, about the years of Tuesday mornings that looked like every other Tuesday morning. The athlete who becomes untouchable in their sport does not attribute it to one transformative training camp. They attribute it, quietly, to the fact that they simply never stopped showing up, long after everyone with more raw talent had gotten bored. You must make peace with an uncomfortable fact. Your empire will be built primarily on days that feel completely unremarkable. If you're waiting for the day to feel significant before you act with significance, you will wait forever because compounding is invisible in the moment. It only becomes visible in retrospect, and by then, the people who quit on day 40 because nothing was happening are nowhere to be found to witness it. This reframe changes everything about how you should evaluate a day. Stop asking, did today feel productive? Start asking, did today add 1 brick regardless of how it felt? The feeling is irrelevant. The brick is everything. The systems. System 1. The minimum viable action, MVA. For every goal you hold, define the smallest possible unit of daily action that still counts as genuine progress. An action so small that skipping it would feel more absurd than doing it. Not write for 2 hours. Instead, write 150 words. Not network aggressively. Instead, send 1 message to 1 person. The MBA is deliberately undersized because its purpose is not to maximize a single day's output. It's to make the streak unbreakable. A goal you can hit on your worst day is a goal you will actually hit. A goal calibrated to your best day is a goal that will humiliate you on every ordinary day, and ordinary days are 90% of your life. System 2. The non-negotiable floor. Separate your daily action into a floor and a ceiling. The floor is the MBA. It happens regardless of mood, sleep, weather, grief, or celebration. The ceiling is what you do when energy and circumstance allow for more. Most people conflate these two and end up doing neither consistently because they only permit themselves to act when conditions are ideal for the ceiling version. Decouple them. The floor is sacred and unconditional. The ceiling is a bonus, never a requirement. System 3. The evidence log. Every night, write 1 sentence documenting the day's brick. What specific 1% action you completed. This is not a journal for feelings. It is a ledger for proof. Over 90 days, this log becomes irrefutable, physical evidence that you are not the person who always quits, a story many high achievers secretly carry about themselves. The log destroys that story with data, not affirmation. System 4. The boredom tolerance drill. Deliberately choose 1 repetitive task each week and do it without seeking novelty, shortcuts, or stimulation. This is training, literal psychological conditioning for your capacity to sustain unglamorous effort. Most people have never built this muscle because modern life is engineered to eliminate boredom at every turn. But the empire is built precisely in the terrain that stimulation-addicted minds cannot tolerate. Train the tolerance deliberately, the way an athlete trains a specific muscle group, not incidentally. The closing declaration. Picture the version of you standing 3 years from this exact page. Not the dramatic version from a highlight reel, the real one. She has not had a single miraculous month. He has not experienced 1 lightning bolt transformation broadcast to an audience. What has happened instead is quieter and far more permanent. 1,000 unremarkable days, each one adding a single brick that nobody was watching get laid. That structure is no longer fragile. It cannot be toppled by one bad week because it was never built on the emotional high of any single day to begin with. While others were waiting for the mood, the moment, the motivation to arrive before they'd allow themselves to act, you were laying brick number 40, then 41, then 4100, indifferent to whether Tuesday felt inspiring. This is the quiet, unglamorous, unstoppable mechanism behind every empire that has ever lasted. Not the leap, the layer, not the miracle, the method. You do not need a better mood to begin today's 1%. You need only the decision, already made, that today's brick gets laid regardless of how today feels. And tomorrow's decision will already be easier because you will no longer be starting. You will be continuing. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Identity. The hook. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your self-concept. Every empire you have ever admired was preceded, quietly, by a person who first decided who they were, and only afterward discovered what that person naturally did. The problem beneath the problem. Most people build their lives backward. They chase an outcome, the fit body, the seven-figure business, the mastery of a craft, and hope that achieving the outcome will eventually make them feel like the kind of person who deserves it. This is exactly reversed from how durable transformation actually works, and it is why so many outcome chasers achieve a goal and then, mysteriously, unravel it within months. They hit the number on the scale and slide back. They land the big client and then sabotage the follow-through. They achieve the milestone their outcome-focused mind demanded, but nothing underneath has changed, so the system that produced the old results simply reasserts itself. Consider a man I'll call Tabena, a composite drawn from a pattern seen across countless case studies of transformation and relapse. Tabena wanted to become a disciplined person. He set a goal: lose 18 kilograms in 4 months. He achieved it through brute willpower, restrictive eating, and daily dread. The day he hit his target weight, he had a small celebratory meal. Within 8 months, he had regained all 18 kilograms and then some. What happened? Tabena never stopped being, at the identity level, someone who struggles with food and forces himself through willpower. He achieved an outcome using a temporary override of his self-concept, not a replacement of it. The moment the intense goal pressure lifted, his underlying identity reasserted control, because identity is the operating system, and goals are merely applications running temporarily on top of it. When the applications close, the operating system remains exactly as it was. This is the central error of outcome-based transformation. It treats the symptom while leaving the root system fully intact. And here is the deeper psychological mechanism at play. Every action you take is a vote for a version of yourself. Skip the workout, and you cast a small vote for, I am someone who skips workouts. Do the workout, even a pathetic, half-hearted, 5-minute version of it, and you cast a vote for, I am someone who trains. No single vote determines the election, but over months and years, the votes accumulate into a majority, and that majority becomes your default self. The version of you that operates automatically, without requiring willpower, because it has simply become who you are. This explains a phenomenon you have likely witnessed and possibly envied. People who seem to maintain extraordinary discipline without visible strain. They're not exercising more willpower than you. They have simply cast enough identity votes in a particular direction that the behavior no longer requires a fight. It has become structural. Their brain no longer asks, should I train today? Any more than it asks, should I brush my teeth today? The question has been permanently retired by sheer accumulated repetition. The paradigm shift. Here is the reversal that must anchor everything else in this book. Stop setting outcome goals as your primary target. Set identity statements, and let outcomes become the natural residue of that identity operating over time. This is not a semantic trick. It fundamentally changes what you optimize for on a daily basis. An outcome goal asks, did I lose weight today? A question that is almost always unanswerable in the affirmative on any single day, which breeds discouragement and eventual abandonment. An identity goal asks instead, did I act like a disciplined person today? A question you can answer honestly and affirmatively every single day, regardless of what the scale, the bank account, or the metric says on that particular date. The identity-based builder does not think, I am trying to build a business. They think, I am an entrepreneur, and entrepreneurs make one sales call a day, review their numbers weekly, and treat their word as their bond. The behaviors follow automatically from the self-concept, rather than being forced onto a self-concept that resists them. You're no longer fighting yourself for compliance. You have redefined the self doing the fighting. This is why the most reliable predictor of long-term success is not motivation, intelligence, or even discipline as commonly understood. It is the speed and completeness with which someone adopts the identity of who they are trying to become, well before the external evidence justifies that identity. The founder calls themselves a founder from day one, not after the first million in revenue. The writer calls themselves a writer after the first unpublished page, not after the bestseller. The identity precedes the proof. This feels to the rational mind almost fraudulent, and that discomfort is precisely the threshold you must learn to walk through. The systems. System 1, the identity statement. Write a single sentence defining who you are becoming, phrased in the present tense as an already true fact, not a future aspiration. Not, I want to be disciplined. Instead, I am someone who follows through on commitments to myself. Read this statement each morning before you check a single external input. No phone, no messages, no news. The sequence matters. Identity must be reinforced before the outside world has a chance to hand you a competing narrative about who you are today. System 2, the vote-casting filter. Before any consequential daily decision, to train or skip, to make the call or avoid it, to write or scroll, ask one question: what would the identity I'm building do right now? This single filter collapses decision fatigue into a near-instant response, because you are no longer negotiating with your immediate impulses. You're simply consulting the constitution you've already written for yourself. System 3, the evidence reframe. Every time you complete even a minuscule act aligned with your identity statement, verbally or mentally name it as evidence. That's what a disciplined person does. This is not affirmation for its own sake. It is deliberate, active construction of a self-narrative built on documented behavior rather than wishful thinking. Over time, this reframe becomes self-reinforcing. Acting in alignment with the identity produces evidence, and the evidence strengthens the identity, which makes the next aligned action easier still. System 4, the identity autopsy. Weekly, review any moment where your behavior contradicted your identity statement, not to punish yourself, but to diagnose the mechanism. Ask, what environmental trigger, emotional state, or unmet need produced the contradiction? Identity change is not derailed by occasional failure. It is derailed by unexamined failure that gets buried in shame rather than converted into design intelligence for the coming week. The closing declaration. There will come a morning, not dramatic, not marked by any external fanfare, when you will realize you no longer decide to show up. You simply show up, the way you simply breathe, because the identity has moved from something you're performing to something you simply are. The person who once needed willpower to open the laptop, lace the shoes, or make the call will have quietly ceased to exist, replaced by someone for whom these actions require no internal negotiation whatsoever. This is the architecture beneath every empire that outlasts its founder's motivation, energy, or mood. Not a person forcing behavior through sheer force of will, day after exhausting day, but a person who became, at the level of identity, the kind of human being who produces that behavior as a simple byproduct of existing. Build the identity first. The empire will follow it the way a shadow follows a body, not because it is being chased, but because it has no other choice. Chapter 3, the physics of friction. The hook. Willpower is the most expensive resource you own, and you have been spending it on problems that a single environmental adjustment could have solved for free. The disciplined life is not built by people with more willpower. It is built by people who have engineered their surroundings so that willpower is rarely required. The problem beneath the problem. There is a seductive and deeply mistaken belief embedded in most disciplined culture that the solution to inconsistency is always internal. Try harder, want it more, dig deeper. This belief flatters the ego because it frames every failure as a private moral shortcoming rather than a design flaw. But it also guarantees repeated failure because it ignores the single most predictive variable in human behavior. Not motivation, not character, but friction. Friction is the sum total of small obstacles standing between you and an action. It is measured not in difficulty, but in steps, the number of decisions, motions, and moments of resistance required before an action begins. And here is the discomfort you must sit with. Friction has far more control over your behavior than your values do. Consider a composite case, a woman I'll call Ngozi, who wanted to read for 30 minutes each night instead of scrolling her phone before sleep. She valued reading. She believed in reading. She told everyone, including herself, that she was a reader. And yet, night after night, she reached for the phone on her nightstand instead of the book on her shelf across the room. Was this a failure of character? No, it was a failure of architecture. The phone required 0 steps. It was already in her hand, already unlocked by habit, already loaded with dopamine-triggering content. The book required rising, walking, retrieving, and returning. 4 small frictions standing between her stated value and her actual behavior. When Ngozi finally solved this, she did not solve it through more willpower. She solved it by physically placing the book on her pillow each morning so that she would have to move it to get into bed, and by leaving her phone charging in the kitchen overnight. She did not become a more disciplined person overnight. She became a person operating inside an environment that had been redesigned to make the desired behavior the path of least resistance, and the undesired behavior the path of most resistance. This single case illustrates a truth that most disciplined literature dramatically underweights. You are not fighting your lack of willpower. You are fighting badly designed friction gradients, and you have been blaming yourself for a problem that a 15-minute redesign could largely eliminate. The inverse is equally true and equally underweight. Bad habits do not persist because you are weak. They persist because they have been engineered, often accidentally, sometimes by companies with enormous financial incentive to keep you engaged, to have almost 0 friction. The notification requires no effort to see. The snack requires no effort to reach. The show autoplays without your consent. Every frictionless bad habit is, in effect, competing against a good habit that usually requires deliberate, effortful activation. This is not a fair fight, and no amount of moral resolve reliably wins an unfair fight over the long run. The fight must be re-engineered before it can be won. The paradigm shift. Here is the reframe that must replace the old model entirely. Stop trying to become a person who overcomes friction through force of will. Become a person who systematically studies and manipulates the friction gradients of your own environment until the desired behavior becomes the default, low-effort path. This shifts your daily focus from an exhausting, ongoing battle of internal resistance to a one-time act of environmental engineering that pays dividends indefinitely. You do not need to win the willpower battle every single day for the rest of your life. You need to win the design battle once, well, and then let the environment do the enforcing on your behalf, day after day, without requiring your conscious effort at all. This is precisely how the most consistent performers in any domain operate, though they rarely describe it in these terms. The elite athlete does not summon superhuman motivation each morning to train. They have arranged their gear by the door, their schedule blocked before anyone else can claim the time, their training partner expecting them at a fixed hour, creating social friction against skipping. The prolific writer does not wait for inspiration. They have a dedicated writing space stripped of distraction, a fixed time block protected on the calendar, and a closed-door policy that removes the friction of starting while adding friction to the temptation of stopping. Willpower, in this model, is not eliminated. It is conserved for the rare moments that genuinely require it, rather than squander daily on problems that design could have solved permanently. The systems. System 1. The two-step rule. For any habit you want to build, ensure it requires no more than 2 physical steps to begin. Want to journal each morning? The journal and pen must already be open on the table where you have coffee, not in a drawer, not in another room. Want to exercise? Your clothes must be laid out the night before, visible, requiring only that you put them on. Every additional step you eliminate meaningfully increases the probability of follow-through. This is not a minor optimization. In behavioral research on habit formation, friction reduction is consistently one of the strongest predictors of consistency, often outperforming increases in motivation or reward. System 2. The inversion audit. For any habit you want to eliminate, conduct the opposite audit. Add steps, not motivation-based warnings. Remove the app from your home screen and require a manual search to open it. Store snack foods in opaque containers on a high shelf rather than at eye level. Leave your phone in a different room while working rather than relying on the discipline to ignore it while it sits inches from your hand. You're not trying to become someone with superhuman resistance to temptation. You're trying to make temptation require enough effort that your baseline laziness works in your favor for once. System 3. The environmental walkthrough. Once a month, physically walk through your home, workspace, and daily routes as if you were a stranger studying your own behavior. Ask, at every point of friction or ease, does this design serve the person I am building or the person I'm trying to leave behind? Most people never conduct this audit and are astonished, once they finally do it, at how many of their daily failures were quietly engineered by furniture placement, app default settings, and grocery store habits rather than any deficiency of character. System 4. The pre-commitment trap. Engineer irreversible or costly-to-reverse commitments that remove future decision points entirely. Pay for the year of coaching in advance rather than month to month. Schedule the meeting with a collaborator who is expecting you, creating social cost for backing out. Automate the transfer to your savings account on payday before the money is visible in your spending balance. Pre-commitment does not require you to be disciplined in the moment of temptation. It requires you to be disciplined once, in advance, when your judgment is clear and your motivation is high, and then simply lets that earlier decision govern the weaker moment that would otherwise have derailed you. The closing declaration. Imagine walking into your own home, your own workspace, your own daily routine, and finding that every single object, every default setting, every physical arrangement has been quietly conspiring in your favor for months. The gym clothes are already laid out. The temptation requires 3 extra, deliberate steps you designed on purpose. The important work sits one glance away, and the distraction sits, inconveniently, in another room entirely. You are no longer the exhausted general fighting the same battle every single morning, relying on a finite and depleting resource to win. You have become the architect who built the battlefield so favorably, so far in advance, that most days there is barely a battle left to fight. This is not a lesser form of discipline. It is a more intelligent one, the kind that scales, that survives your worst days, and that quietly, invisibly, does the work of 1,000 acts of willpower you will now never have to summon at all. Chapter 4. The Discipline of Boredom. The hook. The empire is never lost in the dramatic crisis. It is lost to the 11,000th ordinary Tuesday, when nothing is wrong, nothing is exciting, and no one would notice if you quietly stopped trying. Every builder who lasts has made peace with a truth that every quitter refuses to accept. Most of the road is boring, and the boring part is not a detour from the path. It is the path itself, the problem beneath the problem. We are, all of us, living inside an unprecedented experiment in stimulation. Every screen, every app, every algorithm has been engineered by extraordinarily talented people whose sole professional objective is to make monotony feel intolerable so that you reach for the device instead. This has produced a generation of otherwise capable people who possess a stimulation threshold so elevated that ordinary, unglamorous, repetitive effort now registers in the nervous system as something close to genuine distress. This is not weakness. It is conditioning. And conditioning, unlike character, can be identified, studied, and deliberately reversed. Consider a composite figure, a young professional I'll call Chitty, who wanted to master a technical skill that would take roughly 2 years of steady practice to reach genuine competence. Chitty was intelligent, resourced, and sincerely motivated at the outset. He lasted 6 weeks, not because the material became too difficult. The difficulty was, if anything, decreasing as his competence grew, but because the sensation of practicing stopped producing novelty. The early weeks had the thrill of rapid, visible improvement. The middle months offered something far less rewarding: repetition, plateau, and the quiet, grinding sense that nothing was happening, even though, this is the part Chitty could not see, enormous neurological consolidation was happening beneath the surface, invisible to conscious sensation. Chitty's collapse illustrates the central trap of this chapter. The middle of any worthwhile pursuit is, almost by mathematical necessity, the least stimulating part of the entire process. And it is also, simultaneously, the part responsible for the overwhelming majority of the eventual result. The early days are novel by default. The final days, near mastery, are often deeply satisfying, rich with visible competence and recognition. But the middle, the long, undifferentiated stretch where competence is being built silently, below the threshold of noticeable daily improvement, offers neither novelty nor payoff. It offers only the raw, unadorned experience of doing the work because the work needs doing. This is precisely where the majority of ambitious people quit, not because they lack ability and not even because they lack commitment in the abstract, but because they have never trained the specific psychological skill of tolerating unstimulating repetition. They have trained many other skills. They have simply never trained this one, because modern life has been engineered so thoroughly to eliminate the need for it that most people reach adulthood having almost never practiced sustained boredom tolerance at all. The paradigm shift here is the reframe that must anchor this chapter permanently in your operating philosophy. Boredom is not a signal that something is wrong with your path. It is frequently a signal that you are exactly where the real building happens. The instinct to interpret boredom as information. This isn't working. I should pivot. I should try something new, is one of the most expensive misreadings available to an ambitious mind, because it mistakes the feeling of stagnation for the fact of stagnation, when in reality these two are frequently unrelated. Growth in any complex skill or venture is not linear. It follows what researchers of skill acquisition often describe as a plateau and leap pattern: long stretches of apparently flat, unrewarding effort, punctuated by comparatively sudden and disproportionate jumps in capability. The jump itself only made possible by the invisible consolidation that occurred throughout the boring plateau. If you quit during the plateau, precisely because it is boring and offers no evidence of progress, you never reach the leap that the plateau was quietly building toward. This is why persistence through monotony is not merely a virtue. It is a structural precondition for compounding to occur at all. You must therefore reframe boredom from an enemy signal into something closer to a training stimulus, uncomfortable in the moment, precisely because it is doing something. Just as a muscle grows through the discomfort of resistance, your capacity for sustained, unstimulated effort grows through the deliberate, repeated experience of doing unglamorous work without the reward of novelty. This capacity, once built, becomes one of the rarest and most valuable competitive advantages available to any builder, precisely because so few people have bothered to build it in an age engineered to make it unnecessary. The systems. System 1. The monotony rep. Once daily, complete one task specifically chosen for its repetitive, unstimulating nature. Reviewing the same numbers, running the same drill, editing the same paragraph for the 5th time, without introducing novelty, music, or stimulation to make it easier. Treat this as a literal training rep for your boredom tolerance, tracked with the same seriousness as a physical exercise set. Over weeks, you will notice the same phenomenon that occurs with physical training. What once felt unbearable begins to feel merely neutral, and eventually almost comfortable. System 2. The Plateau Journal. During any stretch where you feel you are not improving, record, factually and without interpretation, exactly what you did that day. Do not evaluate whether it felt productive. Simply log the action. Months later, review the entire log at once. This retrospective view frequently reveals a rate of accumulated effort and incremental change that was completely invisible in the daily experience. Direct evidence that the plateau was never actually flat, only perceived as flat from too close a vantage point. System 3. The Novelty Fast. For one designated period each week, a single evening, a single morning, deliberately abstain from all novel stimulation. No new content, no social media, no switching between tasks for variety. Sit inside a single, potentially repetitive activity and observe your own restlessness without acting on it. This is not punishment. It is calibration, recalibrating a nervous system that has been trained by constant novelty to treat any absence of stimulation as an emergency requiring immediate resolution. System 4. The Long Horizon Anchor. Attach every unglamorous daily task to a written statement of the multi-year outcome it is quietly building toward, and revisit that statement specifically on the most boring days, not the exciting ones. The mind that only connects daily effort to long-term outcome during moments of inspiration will lose that connection precisely when it is needed most, during the stretches of monotony where inspiration is entirely absent, and only the deliberately reinforced logical link between action and future outcome remains available to sustain the behavior. The Closing Declaration. There will be a version of you further down this road than you can currently see who has become quietly, almost eerily comfortable inside stretches of effort that would have driven the current version of you to distraction. Not because that future self has developed some rare, unteachable gift, but because they simply logged more reps of tolerating the unglamorous middle than almost everyone around them was willing to log. While others abandoned their plateau in search of a more stimulating alternative, mistaking their own discomfort for evidence of the wrong path, you stayed inside the boring middle long enough to reach the leap the plateau was building toward all along. This is the discipline that almost nobody talks about because it makes for a poor highlight reel. The discipline of enduring the parts of the process that offer no applause, no dopamine, and no proof until the proof arrives on its own schedule, built entirely from days that felt at the time like nothing was happening at all. Chapter 5. The Compounding of Trust. The Hook. Every empire you have ever admired was, at its foundation, an unbroken chain of kept promises, most of them small, most of them unwitnessed, all of them compounding into something the world eventually decided to call trust. And trust, once accumulated at scale, is the closest thing to magic available in human affairs. The problem beneath the problem. We have spent 4 chapters examining what consistency does inside you, how it rewires identity, dissolves the need for willpower, and builds tolerance for the unglamorous middle. But consistency does something equally powerful outside you, in the perception of every person who observes your behavior over time. And this external effect is so poorly understood that most ambitious people accidentally sabotage it while chasing something they believe matters more, being impressive. Consider 2 composite professionals, both real patterns observed repeatedly across industries. The first, a man I'll call Emeka, was undeniably brilliant. Sharp analysis, dazzling presentations, occasional flashes of genius insight that left colleagues in awe. But Emeka was unreliable in small, forgivable-seeming ways. A deadline missed here, a promise follow-up that never arrived there. A meeting attended 20 minutes late because something more interesting had come up. Each individual lapse was minor. None, in isolation, was a firing offense or a reputation-ending event. But over 3 years, a pattern crystallized in the minds of everyone who worked with him. Brilliant, but you can't quite build on him. The second, a woman I'll call Folake, was competent but unremarkable in any single interaction, no flashes of genius, no dazzling presentations. But Folake did something Emeka never managed. She did precisely what she said she would do. When she said she would do it, every single time, for 3 consecutive years. No exceptions worth mentioning. By year 2, colleagues had started routing the most consequential, highest-stakes projects toward Folake by default, without deliberation, because the decision required none. Everyone already knew, at a near-instinctive level, that whatever landed on Folake's desk would be handled exactly as promised. By year 3, Folake was earning more, trusted with more authority, and considered for opportunities that never reached Emeka's desk at all, despite his superior raw talent. This is not a fluke or morality tale. It is the direct, predictable output of a psychological mechanism operating in every human being who has ever observed another person's behavior over time. We do not extend trust based on someone's peak capability. We extend trust based on someone's demonstrated floor, the reliable minimum we can count on, repeated often enough that we stop needing to verify it. This is the piece almost entirely missing from conventional ambition culture, which fixates obsessively on peak performance. The best pitch, the most impressive credential, the most dazzling single output, while radically underweighting the compounding value of an unbroken floor of reliability. Peak performance earns attention. Reliable floors earn access. Access to bigger opportunities, larger resources, and the kind of long-term relationships that no single impressive moment can purchase. Because access requires something a single moment cannot provide, a track record long enough to remove risk from the other party's decision. The paradigm shift. Here is the reframe this chapter demands. Stop optimizing primarily for being impressive in any single interaction. Start optimizing for being predictable across every interaction, because predictability, compounded over time, is what actually converts into opportunity, capital, and authority. This does not mean abandoning ambition or excellence. It means recognizing that excellence delivered inconsistently registers in the observing mind of others as noise, while modest competence delivered with unbroken reliability registers as signal. And humans, when allocating trust, resources, and opportunity, overwhelmingly favor signal over noise, even when the noise contains occasional flashes far more impressive than the signal ever produces. Every person you interact with, a client, a collaborator, an employer, an audience, is silently running a background calculation about you with every single interaction, whether they're conscious of it or not. Can I count on this person, or do I need to verify them? Every kept promise, however small, reduces the perceived need for verification. Every unkept promise, however minor it feels to you in the moment, increases it. And here is the compounding effect that most people never grasp. Once someone crosses the threshold from needs verification to can be trusted without verification, an entirely different category of opportunity becomes available to them. The kind that requires delegation, autonomy, and risk tolerance from the other party, none of which is extended to someone still being actively verified. This is why unglamorous, boring reliability, showing up on time, delivering exactly what was promised, communicating proactively when something changes rather than going silent, is not a lesser or supporting virtue beneath talent and ambition. It is frequently the primary determinant of who gets handed the largest opportunities in any field, precisely because it is the one variable that scales trust without requiring the observer's continued effort to monitor it. The systems. System 1, the promise ledger. Track every commitment you make to another person, deadlines, follow-ups, deliverables, in a single visible list, and review it daily. Most broken trust does not happen through dramatic betrayal. It happens through small commitments quietly forgotten because they were never externalized anywhere and simply evaporated from working memory. A written ledger converts your reliability from a function of memory, which fails, into a function of process, which does not. System 2, the under-promise calibration. Deliberately estimate your delivery timelines and capacity with a built-in buffer beyond your optimistic internal estimate, and treat the buffered number, not the optimistic one, as your actual promise. Reliability is measured entirely by the gap between what was promised and what was delivered, and a smaller, easily met promise kept consistently builds more trust than a larger, impressive promise met only some of the time. System 3. The proactive disclosure habit. The instant you know a commitment will be missed or altered, communicate this immediately before being asked. This single habit, more than almost any other, separates people who are trusted with escalating responsibility from those who plateau, because it demonstrates that even failure will be handled with transparency, which paradoxically increases trust even the moment reliability itself has technically failed. System 4. The floor audit. Weekly, review not your best output of the week, but your worst, the lowest quality thing you delivered, the latest you arrived, the least prepared you were for any interaction. This audit deliberately ignores your peaks, because your peaks are not what determines whether others build on you. It is your floor, and only your floor, that determines the ceiling of trust others are willing to extend. The closing declaration. There will come a point, quiet, undramatic, arriving without any single announced moment, when you notice that opportunities have begun finding you rather than requiring pursuit. Not because you became more talented than everyone around you, though you likely did become more capable along the way, but because over months and years of unremarkable, unwitnessed reliability, you became the answer to a question every serious person is silently asking about everyone they might work with. Can I build on this person without watching them constantly? The empires that last are rarely built by the most dazzling individual in any given room. They are built by the person whose word, once given, required no further verification. The person other people learned, through hundreds of small, boring, kept promises, that they could simply trust and move on. That reputation, once fully compounded, becomes one of the only genuine moats available in a world otherwise saturated with talent. Build it one kept promise at a time, and one day you will find that the world has quietly decided, without ever announcing the decision, to hand you far more than you ever had to ask for. Chapter 6. The Momentum Multiplier. The hook. A boulder resting on flat ground requires enormous force to move an inch. That same boulder, once rolling downhill, will crush anything in its path with almost no additional effort from you at all. Discipline is the force required to start the boulder moving. Momentum is what makes the empire feel, eventually almost inevitable. The problem beneath the problem. Most people evaluate their progress by measuring output on any given day, comparing today's effort to yesterday's, and quietly concluding that nothing much is accumulating. This is a measurement error of the highest order, because momentum does not operate on a linear scale. It operates on a threshold scale. Nothing visible happens for a long stretch, and then, once a critical mass of consistent action has accumulated, the entire system begins moving with a force disproportionate to any single day's contribution. Consider a composite founder, a woman I will call Amara, who spent 14 months publishing a single piece of content weekly to an audience of, for most of that period, fewer than 200 people. Every week felt identical to the last. No dramatic growth, no viral moment, nothing that would justify, on any single Tuesday, the hours she poured into the effort. Colleagues gently suggested she was wasting time on a platform that wasn't working. She continued anyway, not from blind faith, but from a specific understanding she had cultivated, that audiences, like empires, do not grow in straight lines. They grow in compounding curves that are nearly flat for a long stretch, and then bend sharply upward once accumulated trust, accumulated content, and accumulated word of mouth cross a threshold that cannot be predicted in advance, only earned through unglamorous repetition. In month 16, a single piece of her content was shared by someone with significant reach. That piece did not succeed because it was dramatically better than the 200 pieces before it. It succeeded because it landed on top of 14 months of accumulated groundwork, a body of prior content for new visitors to explore, a reputation for consistency that made her seem credible rather than opportunistic, and an established voice that had been quietly refined across dozens of unwitnessed repetitions. Within a year, Her audience had grown roughly 60-fold. The single viral moment was the visible trigger. The invisible momentum built across 14 boring months was the actual cause. This is the mechanism almost nobody explains clearly. Momentum is not something you feel building in real time. It is something that becomes visible only after it has already accumulated past a threshold, which means you must continue investing in it during the entire period when it offers you no evidence that it exists. This is precisely why so many builders quit in month 11 of a 14-month build. Not because they were on the wrong path, but because the reward structure of momentum is backloaded in a way that feels, moment to moment, indistinguishable from failure. The paradigm shift. The paradigm shift here demands that you fundamentally distrust your moment-to-moment sense of whether something is working. Momentum must be tracked through leading indicators of consistent input, not lagging indicators of visible output, because visible output will remain flat for far longer than your patience will naturally tolerate. This means redefining what counts as evidence of progress. The traditional mind asks, is this producing results? And finding the answer unsatisfying for months at a stretch abandons the effort. The momentum-literate mind asks a different question entirely. Have I maintained the input consistently? And treats an affirmative answer to that question as sufficient justification to continue, entirely independent of whether the output has yet become visible. This is not blind faith. It is an accurate model of how compounding systems actually behave, applied with discipline even when your emotional system is screaming that the model must be wrong. The systems. System 1. The input tracker, not the output tracker. Track the consistency of your actions, sessions completed, pieces published, calls made, rather than fixating daily on results. Results lag input by a margin most people underestimate by an order of magnitude. Judging the system by results too early is like judging a seed by digging it up weekly to check on the roots. System 2. The threshold reframe. When progress feels flat, explicitly remind yourself that the flat feeling is not evidence of a flat trajectory. It is a predictable phase of any compounding system, and the only path past it runs directly through continued, unglamorous input. System 3. The momentum journal. Log every small external signal, an unsolicited compliment, a returning customer, a slightly larger audience number, no matter how minor. These are early threshold signals, easily dismissed individually, but powerful evidence in aggregate that the system is quietly bending toward acceleration. System 4. The anti-comparison clause. Refuse to benchmark your month 14 self against someone else's visible month 14 success, because you cannot see their invisible months 1 through 13. Comparing your flat middle to someone else's visible peak guarantees despair built on an incomplete picture. The closing declaration. There is a day coming, unannounced and unmarked on any calendar, when the boulder you have been pushing uphill for what felt like an eternity will finally crest the ridge, and from that point forward, gravity itself will begin doing work you once had to force with your own hands. You will not need to remember exactly which Tuesday it happened. You will simply notice, looking backward, that the empire has begun moving under a force greater than your daily effort alone could explain, built entirely from the months you kept pushing when nothing visible proved you should. Chapter 7. The Cost of Comfort. The hook. Comfort is not the reward for building an empire. It is the drug that prevents one from ever being built. Every plateau you have ever hit was not a wall. It was a couch, and you sat down on it voluntarily. The problem beneath the problem. The human nervous system is fundamentally a comfort-seeking mechanism. It was shaped by an environment where conserving energy and avoiding unnecessary risk kept organisms alive long enough to reproduce. This machinery has not updated itself for a world where the primary threat to your future is not a predator, but a slow, comfortable erosion of ambition, one easy choice at a time. Comfort does not announce itself as a danger. It arrives disguised as reasonable self-care, deserved rest, or simple pragmatism. And this disguise is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Consider a composite manager, a man I will call Bayo, who reached a respectable, well-compensated position by his early 30s through genuine hard work. Then something subtle shifted. He began describing his current role as comfortable, a word he used with pride, as though comfort were the finish line rather than a warning sign. He stopped taking on stretch assignments. He stopped studying material outside his immediate job requirements. He told himself, sincerely, that he had simply reached a stage of life where he valued balance over ambition. 5 years later, when the company restructured and his role was eliminated, Bayo discovered that his skills had quietly atrophied during those comfortable years, while peers who had continued seeking difficulty had become substantially more capable and substantially more employable. Comfort had not been a reward for his earlier hard work. It had been a slow withdrawal from the very capacities that hard work had built. This illustrates the core danger explored in this chapter. Comfort is not neutral. It is actively subtractive. Skills, discipline, and capacity are not static assets that remain at whatever level you last achieved them. They are living systems that either continue growing under deliberate strain or begin quietly decaying the moment strain is removed. There is no holding pattern. You are either building capacity or losing it, and comfort, however pleasant, is always the second of these, dressed up to feel like the first. The paradigm shift. Here is the reframe. Discomfort is not something to minimize on the way to a comfortable destination. Discomfort, chosen deliberately and calibrated wisely, is the actual mechanism by which capacity is built at every stage of life, indefinitely, with no finish line at which it becomes safe to stop. This does not mean glorifying suffering for its own sake, nor does it mean permanent exhaustion, a topic addressed directly in a later chapter on recovery. It means recognizing that meaningful growth requires operating consistently at the edge of your current capacity rather than comfortably within it, the same way a muscle grows only when loaded beyond its current strength, not when rested indefinitely at a weight it can already handle with ease. The builder who lasts decades is not the one who avoided discomfort. It is the one who developed a sustainable, ongoing relationship with a chosen level of discomfort, rather than either avoiding it entirely or being overwhelmed by too much of it at once. The systems. System 1, the comfort audit. Quarterly, list every area of your life or work that has begun to feel effortless. Effortlessness is not always evidence of mastery. It is frequently evidence that you have stopped choosing difficulty in that domain. For each item, identify one deliberate increase in challenge to reintroduce growth-producing strain. System 2, the voluntary hardship practice. Deliberately schedule regular, moderate hardship unconnected to any external requirement. A difficult conversation you have been avoiding, a skill you have let atrophy, a physical challenge outside your routine. This maintains your tolerance for discomfort as a trained capacity, rather than allowing it to shrink from disuse the way any in-use capacity does. System 3, the growth edge check. Before accepting any new opportunity, ask explicitly, does this stretch my current capacity, or does it simply repeat what I already know how to do comfortably? Repetition of mastered skill has its place, but a life composed entirely of comfortable repetition guarantees eventual stagnation relative to a world that continues moving regardless of your pace. System 4, the recovery discomfort balance. Distinguish deliberately between productive discomfort, which builds capacity, and depleting exhaustion, which erodes it. The goal is not maximum discomfort at all times. It is a sustainable rhythm of chosen strain followed by genuine recovery, repeated indefinitely, the same pattern that governs physical training at every elite level. The closing declaration. Picture the version of you who never let comfort become a permanent address, who visited it, rested there, and then deliberately packed up and moved back toward the edge of capacity again and again, for years, long after the initial hardship that built the empire had passed. That person does not plateau the way Bayo did, blindsided by decay they never noticed happening. They continue expanding quietly, quarter after quarter, because they made peace long ago with an uncomfortable truth. There is no permanent, comfortable plateau available to anyone building something that lasts. There is only the choice, repeated for the rest of your life, to keep walking toward the edge. Chapter 8. The Feedback Loop. The hook. Effort without measurement is a ship without a compass. It may move with tremendous energy and still arrive nowhere useful. The empire builders who compound fastest are rarely the hardest workers in the room. They're the ones who insist on knowing, with precision, whether yesterday's work actually moved them closer to anything at all. The problem beneath the problem. There is a comforting myth that effort alone is virtuous, regardless of whether it is pointed in a useful direction. This myth survives because measuring your own performance honestly is uncomfortable. It risks revealing that weeks of sincere effort produced very little actual movement, a discovery the ego would rather avoid than confront. So most people substitute the feeling of working hard for the discipline of checking whether the hard work is actually functioning. And these two things, while they feel identical from the inside, are entirely different in their consequences. Consider a composite salesperson, a man I will call Uche, who worked long hours every week, sincerely believed in his own diligence, and yet consistently underperformed colleagues who worked visibly less. When his numbers were finally broken down in detail, the cause became obvious. He was spending the majority of his time on a category of prospect that historically converted at a fraction of the rate of another category he was neglecting, simply because the neglected category felt less comfortable to approach. Nobody had ever shown him this breakdown, and he had never sought it out himself, because measuring would have required confronting a possibility his self-image resisted, that his hard work, for all its sincerity, had been misallocated for years. Once Uche began tracking conversion by category weekly, the correction took less than a month. His total hours barely changed. His results nearly doubled. The missing ingredient was never effort. Uche had never lacked that. The missing ingredient was a feedback loop tight enough to reveal, quickly and without ego protection, where the effort was and was not producing results. This reveals the mechanism at the heart of this chapter. Without a feedback loop, effort and results become completely decoupled in your perception, and you will continue investing in whatever feels productive rather than whatever actually is, sometimes for years, because the discomfort of honest measurement is easier to avoid than the discomfort of being wrong. The paradigm shift. The reframe demanded here is this. Measurement is not a bureaucratic afterthought to real work. It is one of the highest leverage activities available, because it is the only mechanism that reliably redirects effort away from comfortable but low-yield activity and toward uncomfortable but high-yield activity, before months or years are wasted discovering the misallocation the hard way. Builders who compound fastest treat feedback loops as load-bearing infrastructure, not optional reflection. They build measurement into the process from day one, specifically because they distrust their own intuitive sense of what is working, correctly recognizing that intuition, absent data, tend to favor whatever feels most comfortable or most familiar, rather than whatever the evidence actually supports. The systems. System 1. The weekly review ritual. Set a fixed, non-negotiable weekly appointment with yourself to review the prior week's key numbers. Whatever metrics genuinely reflect progress toward your goal, not vanity metrics that merely feel encouraging. This single ritual, protected as sacred, prevents months of misallocated effort from accumulating unnoticed. System 2. The leading indicator selection. Identify, in advance, 2 or 3 leading indicators that predict your eventual outcome long before the outcome itself becomes visible, and track those specifically rather than waiting for lagging, big-picture results that arrive too slowly to allow useful correction. System 3. The uncomfortable number rule. Whenever a metric makes you want to look away or explain it as an anomaly, examine it more closely rather than less. Discomfort with a specific number is frequently a signal that it contains the most important information available to you, precisely because it contradicts a story you have been telling yourself. System 4. The course correction threshold. Decide in advance what magnitude of negative signal will trigger a deliberate strategy change. rather than deciding in the emotional moment when a bad number arrives, when you're most likely to either overreact or rationalize it away entirely. The closing declaration. Imagine the version of you who never again mistakes motion for progress, who reviews the numbers with the same steady discipline as brushing your teeth, unclouded by ego, unafraid of what an honest number might reveal. That person corrects course in weeks, not years, because they built a mechanism that catches misallocation early, long before it compounds into a decade of sincere, exhausting effort spent pushing in the wrong direction entirely. Chapter 9. The Power of Constraints. Unlimited time produces almost nothing. Unlimited resources produce almost nothing. It is the wall, not the open field, that forces a builder to discover what they are actually capable of, and every empire of consequence was shaped, at some critical point, by a constraint its founder initially resented and later recognized as the very thing that made the achievement possible. The problem beneath the problem. There's a widespread and deeply mistaken belief that discipline and productivity would flourish if only circumstances were more generous. More time, more capital, more support, fewer obligations. This belief feels intuitive and is almost entirely backward. Study after informal observation of high performers across fields reveals a consistent pattern. The moment resources become unlimited, output quality and consistency frequently decline, not improve, because the mind requires boundaries against which to organize itself, and unlimited resources remove those boundaries entirely. Consider a composite writer, a woman I will call Igioma, who spent years believing she would finally write her book once she had a full free year with no other obligations. When a career transition eventually granted her exactly that, 12 unstructured months with no job, no fixed schedule, ample savings, she wrote almost nothing for the first 4 months, paralyzed by the very spaciousness she had once believed would liberate her. It was only when she imposed an artificial constraint on herself, a fixed 90-minute window each morning, before any other activity, non-negotiable, that meaningful pages finally began to accumulate. The constraint did not limit her creativity. It gave her creativity a container narrow enough to work within, replacing an infinite, paralyzing field of possibility with a manageable, well-defined task. This illustrates the mechanism this chapter addresses directly. Constraints are not obstacles standing between you and your best work. They are frequently the precondition for your best work, because the human mind, faced with infinite options, tends toward paralysis, while the same mind, faced with a well-chosen limitation, tends toward focused, decisive action. The paradigm shift. The paradigm shift required here inverts the instinctive relationship most people hold with limitation. Stop treating constraints as problems to be eliminated before real progress can begin, and start treating them as tools to be deliberately designed, because a well-chosen constraint does more to produce consistent output than almost any amount of additional resource ever could. This reframe explains a pattern observed repeatedly among builders operating under genuine external limitation. Limited capital, limited time due to competing obligations, limited access to conventional resources. Rather than being disadvantaged relative to better resource competitors, as intuition would suggest, these builders frequently outperform them, because the constraint forces a ruthless prioritization that abundance never demands. When you have unlimited time, everything feels equally postponable. When you have 90 minutes, only what genuinely matters survives the cut. The systems. System 1. The artificial deadline. For any open-ended project without an externally imposed deadline, assign one yourself and treat it with the same seriousness as an obligation to another person. Deadlines, even self-imposed ones, activate a different quality of focus than open-ended timelines, which tend to expand to consume however much time is available, regardless of the actual complexity of the task. System 2. The resource cap. Deliberately limit one resource, budget, time, tools below what feels comfortable, and observe how the limitation forces creative problem-solving that abundance would have made unnecessary. Many of the most resourceful solutions in any field emerge specifically from operating under a cap that ruled out the easy, resource-heavy option entirely. System 3. The single option rule. When facing a decision paralyzed by too many possibilities, arbitrarily eliminate all but 2 or 3 options before deliberating further. A narrowed field of realistic choices produces faster, often equally good decisions compared to an unconstrained field that invites endless, unproductive comparison. System 4. The container practice. For any creative or strategic work, define a fixed, non-negotiable container, a specific time window, a specific word count, a specific number of iterations before beginning. The container does not restrict the quality of what emerges within it. It frequently improves that quality by forcing decisions that infinite time would have allowed you to endlessly postpone. The closing declaration. There will be a moment, likely more than one, when you look back at a season of genuine limitation, too little time, too little capital, too little support, and recognize it not as the obstacle you resented while living through it, but as the exact mechanism that forced the focus, the resourcefulness, and the decisive action responsible for whatever you eventually built. The empire was never waiting for more room to grow. It was waiting for a wall narrow enough to define, with total clarity, exactly what mattered. Chapter 10. The Silent Saboteurs. The hook. You will rarely be destroyed by a rival, a recession, or a public failure. You are far more likely to be quietly undone by a pattern operating so close to your own identity that you have never once questioned it. A saboteur wearing your own voice, offering reasonable-sounding explanations for every retreat. The problem beneath the problem. Self-sabotage almost never announces itself as self-sabotage. It arrives disguised as caution, as realism, as a legitimate change in priorities, as exhaustion that seems to justify quitting at the precise moment persistence would have paid off. This disguise is what makes self-sabotage so much more dangerous than external obstacles. An external obstacle can be identified, studied, and strategized against, but a saboteur operating from inside your own reasoning is nearly invisible because it uses your own voice and your own logic to make retreat feel wise rather than fearful. Consider a composite entrepreneur, a man I will call Kwame, who had, across a decade, begun 3 separate ventures, each abandoned within 18 months at almost exactly the point where early traction was beginning to compound into something real. Each time, Kwame had a reasonable-sounding explanation. The market had shifted, a better opportunity had appeared, the timing was not quite right. Each explanation was plausible in isolation. It was only when a mentor pointed out the pattern across all 3 ventures, abandonment clustering suspiciously close to the exact moment of emerging success, that Kwame recognized what was actually happening. He was not failing due to external circumstance. He was, at an unconscious level, more afraid of the responsibility and visibility that came with genuine success than he was afraid of failure. And his mind had been quietly engineering plausible exits at precisely the moment that fear peaked. This is the specific danger this chapter addresses. The saboteur is rarely afraid of failure. It is far more often afraid of the exposure, responsibility, or identity shift that genuine success would require, and it will manufacture perfectly reasonable-sounding justifications for retreat at exactly the moment success draws near enough to make that fear acute. The paradigm shift. The necessary reframe is this. Stop evaluating your reasons for quitting or pivoting purely on their surface logic, and start examining the timing and emotional texture of when those reasons arrive, because a saboteur operating from fear will always sound reasonable. Reasonableness is precisely its camouflage. This requires developing a specific form of self-suspicion that most people never cultivate. Treating your own internal narration as a source that requires cross-examination, not automatic trust, particularly at moments when a decision to quit, pivot, or retreat arrives suspiciously close to genuine forward progress. This is uncomfortable because it asks you to distrust the very voice you have relied on your entire life to make decisions. But the alternative, accepting every plausible-sounding retreat at face value, guarantees that the pattern, once established, will repeat indefinitely across every venture you ever attempt. The systems. System 1, the pattern log. Document every significant retreat, pivot, or abandonment across your history, along with the stated reason and the actual proximity to emerging success at the time. A single instance proves nothing. A pattern across 3 or more instances is data you cannot ethically ignore. System 2, the timing interrogation. Whenever you feel a strong urge to quit or pivot, explicitly ask, is this urge arriving because the path has genuinely become unviable, or because it is beginning to work, and working now demands more exposure, responsibility, or visibility than I am comfortable with? This single question, asked honestly, exposes most saboteurs immediately. System 3, the trusted outside check. Identify one person whose judgment you trust specifically to flag patterns you cannot see in yourself, and grant them explicit permission to challenge your stated reasons for any major retreat. Self-sabotage is, by definition, difficult to detect from inside your own reasoning. An outside perspective is frequently the only reliable countermeasure. System 4, the fear audit. For any major decision to stop or pivot, explicitly separate the practical, external reasons from any underlying emotional discomfort about what continuing would require of you. Increased visibility, increased responsibility, increased risk of public failure. Naming the emotional component directly strips it of the disguise it needs to operate undetected. The closing declaration. There will come a point, and you must actively watch for it, when the path you're building begins to genuinely work. And it is precisely at that point, not before it, that the oldest and most persuasive saboteur you carry will offer you its most reasonable-sounding argument yet for stopping. Recognize the voice. Recognize the timing. And keep walking anyway, because the empire that finally lasts belongs not to the person who never felt the pull to quit at the threshold of success, but to the one who learned to name that pull for exactly what it is and continued regardless. Chapter 11. The compounding of skill. The hook. Talent opens the door. It does not build the house behind it. Every mastery you have ever admired from a distance was constructed, brick by unglamorous brick, by someone who was willing to remain a deliberate beginner in public for far longer than their ego was comfortable with. The problem beneath the problem. There is a quiet, corrosive belief embedded in how most people think about skill. That ability is something you either have or do not have, discovered rather than built. This belief, sometimes called a fixed mindset in psychological research, is comforting in the short term because it removes responsibility for improvement. If skill is innate, then failing to improve is not a choice, merely a fact of nature. But it is comprehensively contradicted by how mastery actually develops in every domain that has been studied closely, from music to chess to medicine to entrepreneurship. Consider a composite case, a young analyst I will call Tund, who watched a senior colleague deliver a flawless client presentation and concluded, privately, that the colleague simply had a gift he himself lacked. What Tund could not see was the 200 earlier presentations that colleague had delivered across a decade, many of them mediocre, several of them outright failures, each one generating specific, uncomfortable feedback that was deliberately incorporated into the next attempt. The gift Tund perceived was not a starting condition. It was the visible tip of an enormous, invisible iceberg of accumulated deliberate repetition, a form of practice specifically structured around pushing at the exact edge of current competence, generating feedback, and adjusting, rather than comfortably repeating what already felt easy. This distinction matters enormously. Not all repetition compounds into skill. Comfortable repetition of what you can already do produces almost no improvement over time. It produces only the comforting sensation of being busy. Skill compounds specifically from repetition deliberately structured at the edge of current ability, generating friction, feedback, and adjustment. 10,000 hours of comfortable repetition produces a person who has done something 10,000 times, not necessarily a person who has become excellent at it. The paradigm shift. The reframe demanded here is this: stop treating skill gaps as evidence of insufficient natural ability and start treating them as evidence of insufficient deliberate repetition at the correct level of difficulty, a completely solvable problem given enough time and the right structure, rather than an unchangeable fact about your inherent capability. This reframe is liberating precisely because it converts a fixed, demoralizing story, "I'm not naturally gifted at this," into an actionable, empowering one. "I have not yet logged sufficient deliberate repetition at the right difficulty level." The first story invites resignation. The second invites a plan. The systems. System 1, the edge of competence practice. Deliberately structure practice sessions to sit just beyond your current comfortable ability, rather than comfortably within it. If a task feels entirely easy, it is very likely producing minimal skill growth, regardless of how much time you spend on it. System 2, the feedback compression loop. Seek feedback as quickly as possible after each attempt, rather than allowing long gaps between action and correction. Skill compounds fastest when the loop between doing, learning what went wrong, and adjusting is tight, ideally within the same day, rather than weeks or months later when the specific details have faded. System 3, the deliberate weakness focus. Identify the single weakest component of your overall skill and disproportionately direct practice time there, rather than further polishing what is already strong. Overall competence is frequently constrained by the weakest link, not the strongest, making targeted weakness-focused practice the highest leverage use of limited practice time. System 4, the long arc patience clause. Explicitly accept, in writing if necessary, that meaningful skill compounding operates on a timescale of years, not weeks, and recalibrate your expectations accordingly before beginning any serious skill-building effort. Most abandoned skill-building attempts are not failures of method. They are failures of an unrealistic timeline colliding with an accurate one. The closing declaration. Picture yourself years from today, performing with a fluency that will look, to anyone observing from the outside, indistinguishable from natural gift. They will not see the 200 mediocre attempts behind it, the deliberately uncomfortable practice sessions, the feedback absorbed without flinching, the years spent willingly remaining a beginner in a field where your ego wanted desperately to already be an expert. They will simply call it talent, the same misreading you once applied to someone else, never knowing that what they're actually witnessing is nothing more mysterious than compounded, deliberate repetition, finally made visible. Chapter 12, the Empire Mindset. There are two entirely different people building what looks from the outside like the same business, the same body of work. One optimizing for how this quarter looks, and one quietly constructing something engineered to still be standing in 20 years. They rarely look different in any given week. They look radically different by the 10th year. The problem beneath the problem. Short-term thinking is not a character flaw. It is the psychologically comfortable default, because immediate outcomes are vivid, measurable, and socially rewarded in ways that long-term outcomes simply cannot compete with. A dramatic quarterly result generates applause now. A decision that sacrifices this quarter's numbers to protect a decade-long trajectory generates, at best, silence, and, at worst, direct criticism from people who cannot see the horizon you are actually building toward. Consider a composite business owner, a woman I will call Kayamika, who ran a growing services company and faced a recurring temptation familiar to any builder. A lucrative short-term contract that would have required compromising the quality standard her business had spent years establishing. The immediate math favored acceptance, significant revenue, minimal apparent cost. She declined it twice, watching competitors accept similar arrangements and post impressive short-term growth numbers she could not immediately match. 5 years later, several of those competitors had been quietly ejected from their industry's most valuable long-term contracts, their reputations for compromised quality having compounded into exactly the kind of distrust described in an earlier chapter. Kayamika's company, having protected its standards through years of unglamorous restraint, was by then handling exactly the category of prestigious, high-margin, long-term work that our short-term optimizing competitors could no longer access. This illustrates the mechanism this chapter names directly. Short-term optimization and long-term compounding are frequently in direct tension, and choosing the long-term path will often look for years like underperformance relative to those choosing the short-term path, right up until the moment the compounding trajectories diverge permanently, at which point the earlier underperformance reveals itself as the actual foundation of durable advantage. The paradigm shift, the reframe required here, is uncomfortable precisely because it demands tolerating a long period of apparent relative disadvantage. Stop measuring your progress against those optimizing purely for short-term visible results, and start measuring it against the specific multi-year trajectory you are deliberately constructing, even when that trajectory requires foregoing gains that are immediately available to anyone willing to sacrifice durability for speed. This does not mean rejecting every short-term opportunity. Many short-term wins genuinely serve long-term goals and should be pursued vigorously. It means developing the specific discernment to distinguish between short-term gains that compound into the empire and short-term gains that quietly cannibalize it, and having the discipline to decline the latter, even when it is dressed up as an obvious opportunity that only a fool would refuse. The systems. System 1. The decade test. Before any significant decision, explicitly ask, how will this look in the context of a 10-year trajectory, not merely this quarter? Decisions that fail this test but pass a purely short-term test deserve heightened scrutiny before proceeding. System 2. The reputation ledger. Track decisions specifically by their long-term reputational cost or benefit, separate from their immediate financial or visible outcome. Reputation compounds on a timescale invisible to quarterly measurement, but decisive over a full career. System 3. The sacrifice log. Explicitly document short-term opportunities deliberately declined in service of the longer trajectory. Reviewing this log periodically provides concrete evidence, during periods of doubt, that the long-term path is being actively chosen rather than passively drifted into. System 4. The horizon anchor. Maintain a written, vivid description of the multi-year outcome you are building toward, and consult it specifically before any decision that pits immediate gain against durable trajectory. A vague long-term goal is easily overridden by a vivid short-term temptation. A vivid long-term goal can compete on equal psychological footing. The closing declaration. There's a version of your empire, 10 years from this exact page, built entirely from the accumulated weight of decisions that looked, in any single quarter, like modest restraint rather than triumph. While others captured every available short-term gain and quietly eroded the foundation beneath them, you will have constructed something engineered specifically to compound rather than merely to impress. Indifferent to how unremarkable any single year of that construction appeared from the outside, because you were never building for the applause of any single year. You were building for the decade that would eventually make the restraint look, in hindsight, like the only strategy that was ever going to work. Chapter 13. The Discipline of Recovery. The hook. The builder who never rests is not the most disciplined person in the room. They are the person most likely to collapse before the empire is finished, mistaking exhaustion for virtue, right up until the body or mind sends an invoice that can no longer be postponed. The problem beneath the problem. Discipline culture has a shadow side rarely discussed with the same enthusiasm as its virtues. The glorification of relentless output, treated as though rest were a form of moral weakness rather than a structural requirement of any system designed to last. This produces a specific and common failure pattern. The highly disciplined person who builds with genuine intensity for a period of months or a few years then suffers a collapse severe enough to erase a substantial portion of the progress built, because the underlying capacity for sustained effort was never actually being renewed, only steadily depleted. Consider a composite executive, a man I will call Segan, who prided himself on never taking a full day fully disconnected from work across nearly 4 years of aggressive company building. He treated exhaustion as evidence of commitment, wearing sleep deprivation almost as a badge of seriousness. In year 4, he experienced a health crisis directly attributable to prolonged, unaddressed stress, forcing an 8-month recovery period during which the company's momentum stalled badly enough to lose significant ground to competitors. The 8 months of enforced rest that his body eventually demanded dwarfed, many times over, any single weekend of deliberate rest he had refused to take across the preceding years. Recovery was never optional. He had simply deferred it involuntarily, at maximum cost, rather than scheduling it deliberately at minimal cost. This reveals the mechanism central to this chapter. Recovery is not the opposite of discipline. It is a structural component of any discipline system designed to compound over years rather than collapse after months, and treating it as optional is not evidence of superior toughness. It is evidence of a system that has not yet encountered its own limits, and therefore has not yet been forced to reckon with the bill. The paradigm shift. The necessary reframe is this. Schedule recovery with the same non-negotiable seriousness you apply to your highest priority work, because recovery is not time stolen from the building process. It is the specific mechanism by which your capacity to build is renewed, without which the entire system eventually depletes past the point of functioning at all. This reframe requires abandoning the false dichotomy between relentless output and rest, replacing it with a rhythm, deliberate, scheduled cycles of intense effort followed by genuine, guilt-free recovery, repeated indefinitely, the same pattern used by elite athletes who understand, far better than most ambitious professionals, that adaptation and growth occur specifically during recovery, not during the strain itself. The strain provides the stimulus. The recovery provides the actual building. The systems. System 1. The scheduled recovery block. Place recovery periods on your calendar with the same fixed, protected status as your most important meetings, rather than treating rest as whatever residual time happens to remain after all other obligations are satisfied. Unscheduled recovery reliably gets consumed by whatever urgent task appears next. System 2. The depletion warning system. Identify, in advance, your personal early warning signs of approaching burnout, specific patterns in sleep, mood, or focus that reliably precede a collapse, and treat their appearance as a mandatory trigger for immediate recovery action, rather than something to push through until a scheduled break arrives. System 3. The full disconnection practice. Regularly practice genuinely full disconnection from work-related input, not partial disconnection that still permits checking messages just in case. Partial disconnection provides almost none of the restorative benefit of full disconnection, while creating the illusion that rest has occurred. System 4. The sustainable pace calibration. Explicitly calculate the pace of effort you could sustain for a full decade, not merely the pace you can sustain for an adrenaline-fueled sprint of a few months, and calibrate your ongoing baseline effort to that sustainable figure, reserving sprint-level intensity for genuinely rare, deliberately chosen occasions rather than treating it as a permanent operating mode. The closing declaration. Picture the version of you who built not through a single unsustainable sprint that ended in collapse, but through a rhythm, years of alternating, deliberate intensity and deliberate recovery, each one renewing the capacity for the next. That person is still building a decade from now, not because they worked harder in any single month than the version who burned out, but because they respected the structural requirement every compounding system eventually demands, that the empire built to last is never built by a builder who forgot they, too, required maintenance. Chapter 14. The multiplier effect of systems. The hook. You cannot personally lift an empire onto your own shoulders and carry it indefinitely. Not because you lack strength, but because any structure that depends entirely on one person's continuous effort has a ceiling exactly as high as that one person's finite capacity, and no higher. The problem beneath the problem. There is a specific trap that catches even highly disciplined builders precisely because their discipline has worked so well for so long. The belief that their own direct, personal effort is the only reliable mechanism for quality and progress, leading them to resist building systems, delegating responsibility, or creating processes that could function without their constant, direct involvement. This trap is seductive because it is initially true. Early on, the builder's own hands-on effort genuinely is the primary driver of quality, and delegating too early, before standards and processes exist, can produce real damage. Consider a composite entrepreneur, a woman I will call Yawanda, who built a highly regarded boutique service business almost entirely through her own personal involvement in every client engagement. For the first several years, this produced excellent results and a strong reputation. But it also produced an invisible ceiling. The business could never grow beyond the number of hours Yawanda personally possessed, and every vacation, illness, or moment of exhaustion directly reduced output, because nothing about the business functioned independently of her constant presence. It took a genuine health scare to force the uncomfortable realization that her own discipline, however excellent, had become the business's single greatest constraint. Over the following 2 years, she deliberately documented her own decision-making processes, trained others to execute them to her standard, and built quality control systems that did not require her personal review of every detail. The business's capacity roughly tripled, not because Yawanda worked harder, but because her judgment and standards had been converted from a personal bottleneck into a replicable system that could operate, largely, without her. This reveals the central mechanism of this chapter. Personal discipline builds the initial quality and momentum of any venture, but personal discipline alone has a hard ceiling equal to one person's finite time and energy. Sustainable, larger-scale compounding requires converting personal discipline into systems, processes, and trained judgment that can operate beyond the limits of any single person's direct involvement. The paradigm shift. The reframe required here asks you to hold two seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. Your personal discipline is the foundation of everything you will build, and yet, if it remains the only mechanism driving quality indefinitely, it will eventually become the primary constraint on how large that building can grow. The goal over time is not to abandon personal discipline, but to deliberately extract it, converting your internal standards into documented systems, trained judgment in others, and repeatable processes, so that the empire's quality no longer depends entirely on your continuous personal presence. This transition is uncomfortable for disciplined people specifically because their discipline has served them so reliably that trusting a system or another person to replicate it feels like a step down in quality. Often, initially, it genuinely is. But the alternative, remaining the sole bottleneck indefinitely, guarantees a ceiling that no amount of additional personal discipline can ever raise. The systems. System 1. The documentation habit. As you develop competence in any recurring task, simultaneously document the specific decision-making process behind it, not merely the steps. Documenting decisions, not just actions, is what eventually allows another person or system to replicate your judgment, not merely your emotions. System 2. The gradual delegation ladder. Delegate responsibility in small, deliberately incremental steps with clear checkpoints for quality review, rather than either withholding all delegation indefinitely or delegating everything abruptly. Trust in a system or a person is built the same way trust in anything else is built, through a track record of small, verified successes. System 3. The standard transfer practice. Deliberately teach not just what to do, but why a given standard matters, to anyone you're training to extend your work. Standards transferred through explanation and repeated demonstration compound into independent judgment. Standards enforced only through direct oversight remain permanently dependent on your presence. System 4. The bottleneck audit. Periodically ask explicitly, what, in this venture, currently cannot function without my direct, personal involvement? Each identified bottleneck becomes a deliberate target for systemization, delegation, or documentation over the following months, gradually raising the ceiling that personal discipline alone could never exceed. The closing declaration. There will be a day when you step away from your own creation for a week, a month, an illness, a genuine rest, and discover, with a mixture of pride and mild disorientation, that it continued operating at the standard you built it to, without requiring your hand on every lever. That day marks the actual transition from a builder to an architect of something larger than any single person's finite capacity, proof that the discipline you spent years cultivating in yourself has finally been successfully translated into a structure capable of carrying forward, without you carrying every brick personally, forever. Chapter 15. The Quiet Legacy. The hook. Nobody will ever throw a parade for your Tuesday. And yet it is the accumulated weight of 10,000 unwitnessed Tuesdays, not any single dramatic Sunday, that will ultimately be remembered as the empire you built, long after the specific days themselves have been forgotten by everyone, including you. The problem beneath the problem. We have spent 14 chapters dismantling the myth of the dramatic leap, replacing it with the quiet mathematics of compounding. Identity, friction, boredom tolerance, trust, momentum, constraints, feedback, skill, patience, and recovery. Each one a discipline practiced far more often in obscurity than in front of any audience. This raises an uncomfortable question that deserves direct confrontation rather than avoidance. If the vast majority of the actual building happens unwitnessed, unapplauded, and largely unremembered even by the person doing it, what exactly is any of this for? Consider a composite elder, a woman I will call Mama Beezy, who spent 40 years running a modest trading business with a reputation across her entire community for absolute reliability and quiet generosity. She never became wealthy by any dramatic measure. She never appeared in any publication. And yet, at her retirement, the sheer number of people whose lives had been meaningfully improved by her consistent, unglamorous presence, employees she had trained and promoted, suppliers she had paid fairly and on time for decades, customers she had extended credit to during difficult seasons without ever mentioning it publicly, revealed an empire entirely invisible to any conventional measure of success, built from tens of thousands of small, unremarked decisions to show up, keep her word, and do the quietly right thing, repeated for 4 decades. This is the final reframe this book must leave you with. The empire was never primarily about the scale of the outcome visible to outside observers. It was about the accumulated character of 10,000 private decisions, most of which nobody but you will ever know are made. And it is precisely this accumulated character, more than any single visible achievement, that constitutes the actual, lasting substance of what you built. The paradigm shift. The final paradigm shift this book asks of you is this. Stop measuring your life's work exclusively by its most visible, applaudable moments, and start recognizing that the true empire has been under construction the entire time, in every quiet decision to act with the discipline described across this book, whether or not anyone was ever watching, whether or not the outcome ever became dramatic enough for anyone else to notice. This does not diminish ambition for visible, large-scale achievement. Pursue it fully, with everything this book has equipped you to bring to that pursuit. But it relocates the actual meaning of the effort away from a finish line that may or may not arrive in the dramatic form you once imagined, and toward the daily, private practice of becoming a specific kind of person, reliable, patient, honest with yourself, willing to do the unglamorous work, a practice whose value does not depend on any particular outcome ever becoming visible to anyone else at all. The systems. System 1. The legacy audit. Periodically ask, independent of any external metric. If nothing about my circumstances ever became more visible or impressive than they are today, would the daily character of how I am building still be something I respect? This question strips away outcome dependence and returns you to the only thing ever fully within your control. System 2. The private discipline review. Regularly review, privately, the disciplines from this entire book: identity, friction design, boredom tolerance, trust building, feedback loops, systems building, recovery, not as a checklist for external achievement, but as a private practice of character valuable on its own terms regardless of scale. System 3. The quiet contribution ledger. Keep a private, unshared record of the ways your consistency has quietly benefited others. A colleague mentored, a promise kept under difficulty, a standard maintained when cutting corners would have been easier and unnoticed. This ledger exists for no audience but you, and is for that exact reason one of the most honest measures of the empire actually being built. System 4. The long memory practice. Periodically imagine yourself decades from now, looking back at this exact period of your life, and ask what version of today's choices that future self would be proudest to have made, not the choices that produce the most visible outcome, but the choices that reflected the deepest integrity with everything this book has argued for. The closing declaration. You began this book believing, perhaps, that an empire was something built through a handful of dramatic, decisive moments, and you now understand at a level far deeper than intellectual agreement that it was never true. It was built, brick by unwitnessed brick, across thousands of ordinary days that offered no applause and demanded no audience, each one a private vote for the specific kind of person you were quietly choosing to become. That accumulation, patient, disciplined, largely invisible to everyone but you, is the actual empire. Not the eventual visible outcome, though that will likely arrive in its own time, on its own schedule, exactly as compounding always does. The empire was the daily 1% all along. It was quietly building the entire time, and it was always, from the very first page, entirely within your hands. Recommendations. How to use this book going forward. This book was never designed to be read once and shelved. Its value compounds the same way the principles inside it do, through repeated, deliberate return. The following recommendations are offered as a practical bridge between finishing this book and living inside its principles for the years ahead. Reread one chapter per week, not the whole book at once. Each chapter contains enough depth to sit with for 7 days of applied practice before moving to the next. Rushing through all 15 chapters in a weekend will leave you with information. Spacing them out will leave you with transformation. Choose one system per chapter, not all 4. Every chapter offered 4 standalone strategic systems. Attempting to implement all 60 systems across this book simultaneously guarantees overwhelm and abandonment. Select the single system from each chapter that addresses your most pressing current obstacle, master it fully, and only then move to the next. Build your 90-day starter plan around 3 chapters. Rather than attempting to apply all 15 chapters at once, select 3 that speak most directly to your current season. Likely a combination from among the myth of the big leap, the architecture of identity, the physics of friction, and the discipline of recovery for most readers beginning this work. Apply their systems consistently for 90 days before layering in additional chapters. Keep the evidence log and promise ledger permanently. Of every system across this book, these 2, introduced in chapters 1 and 5, are recommended as permanent, indefinite practices rather than temporary interventions. They form the backbone of the identity work and trust-building work that every other chapter depends on. Return to chapter 15 whenever the visible results feel too slow. The quiet legacy chapter exists specifically for the moments, inevitable across any multi-year build, when the compounding feels too invisible to justify continued effort. It is not a farewell chapter. It is a chapter to be revisited deliberately whenever doubt threatens to undo months of accumulated discipline. This book has given you the architecture. The building itself, as every chapter has argued, will happen the same way every empire ever has, one unremarkable day at a time. Conclusion. You arrived at this book, most likely, hoping for a spark, a single insight dramatic enough to finally launch the transformation you have been circling for months or years. What you have instead been given, across 15 chapters, is something less immediately thrilling and considerably more durable. A complete architecture for a life built on compounding rather than combustion. There was no single chapter in this book designed to change your life in isolation. That was never the model this book operates on, And by now you understand precisely why. Because the entire argument of these pages has been a sustained case against the very idea of a single transformative moment. What changes a life is not a chapter. It is the daily 1%, applied with the identity clarity of Chapter 2, the environmental intelligence of Chapter 3, the boredom tolerance of Chapter 4, the trust-building patience of Chapter 5, and the 11 principles that followed compounded quietly across months you will not fully appreciate until you look backward from a vantage point this current version of you cannot yet see. The empires you have admired from a distance, the businesses, the bodies of work, the reputations, the lives that seem to run with quiet, sturdy inevitability, were never built by people fundamentally different from you. They were built by people who made peace earlier than most, with an uncomfortable, liberating truth. The boring, unglamorous, unwitnessed daily action is not a lesser substitute for the dramatic breakthrough. It is the only mechanism that ever actually produces one. Close this book and begin the least cinematic, most powerful decision available to you. Showing up tomorrow and the day after with the same quiet discipline as today. That is the entire method. That is how it has always worked. And that, quietly, is how you will build yours.